Hey everybody, welcome to Watches with Dennis, and today I want to talk about James Bond watches. Another one of my hobbies is pinball, and Stern Pinball has announced that they are putting out a James Bond pinball machine, and so I thought the time was right to finally go through James Bond's watches. This is something I've thought about loosely, but there are so many watches across so many films, 25 official films and 6 official James Bonds from Eon Productions, that I've always put off doing it, but I figured now's the time to go ahead, so let's get started. We're going to do it a little bit differently than I think most have probably covered it. I mean, there's only one real way to do it, and that's by film. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the James Bonds real quick, then we're going to kind of break that up into their films sort of all at once, and then run through them, and I think it'll put it out in, I'm hoping, a visually interesting way. Look at the description for additional details regarding the watches that I'm referencing and the articles that I used as my sources. So if you want to learn more, definitely go and check those out. There's only so much that I'm able to cover here. Okay, so we have 6 different actors who have played James Bond across 25 films for Eon Productions, which is sort of the canonical James Bond movies. And these are listed in the order in which the actors started the role. By and large, this is the order they finished them. However, there is an exception revolving around Sean Connery and George Lazenby, but we'll get to that in a moment. So let's go ahead and transition this over to Sean Connery right now, who was in 6 different James Bond movies. Dr. No in 1962, From Russia with Love in 1963, Goldfinger in 1964, Thunderball in 1965, You Only Live Twice in 1967, and Diamonds Are Forever in 1971, which he ended up doing after George Lazenby's film, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, in terms of the watches, Sean Connery supposedly wore his personal Rolex Submariner reference 6358 in 4 of these movies: Dr. No, From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, and Thunderball. The first 3 of these films, it was the only watch known to be worn by James Bond. In Thunderball, however, was the first time we also saw a gadget watch, and that is a Breitling Top Time Chronograph reference 2002. It had the ability to function as a Geiger counter. In You Only Live Twice and Diamonds Are Forever, it's not exactly for certain which watch was worn. It is believed, once again, Sean Connery wore a personal watch, this time the Gruen Precision 510 in both of those movies. Moving on to George Lazenby, he only did 1 film as James Bond. It's on Her Majesty's Secret Service, which came out in 1969. However, in the movie, he wore 3 different watches, but they are all Rolex. He wore the Rolex Submariner reference 5513. Then, in a homage perhaps to Sean Connery, he wore the Rolex Submariner reference 6358. And finally, he wore a Rolex Chronograph reference 6238. After Sean Connery did Diamonds Are Forever, Roger Moore took over the role and ended up doing 7 films, which is the most any James Bond actor has done. He did Live and Let Die in 1973, The Man with the Golden Gun in 1974, The Spy Who Loved Me in 1977, Moonraker in 1979, For Your Eyes Only in 1981, Octopussy in 1983, and A View to a Kill in 1985. In Live and Let Die, he wore 2 watches. One was the Hamilton Pulsar P2, sort of marking the beginning of the quartz era with a very extravagant and noticeable watch. He also wore, though, the Rolex Submariner, reference 5513, much like George Lazenby did. This one, though, was a gadget watch. It contained a circular saw and also had a powerful magnet. In The Man with the Golden Gun, Roger Moore only wore the Rolex Submariner, reference 5513. In The Spy Who Loved Me, he wore 2 watches. One is a Rolex GMT Master. I believe it's reference 1675. In addition, he also wore another gadget watch. It was the Seiko 0674LC, but in the movie, it had the capability to print messages. In Moonraker, Roger Moore wore 1 watch, the Seiko M354 Memory Bank Calendar. However, it was a gadget watch for the film, which was an explosive. In For Your Eyes Only, Roger Moore wore 2 watches, the Seiko 7549-7009 and also the Seiko H357 Duo Display, the latter of which was a gadget watch that could transmit messages. In Octopussy, Roger Moore once again used 2 Seiko watches. One was the Seiko TV watch, and then the gadget watch was the Seiko G757 Sports 100, which in the movie had the ability to follow a tracking device. In A View to a Kill, Roger Moore did not seem to have any gadget watches, but he had 4 different watches on. The Seiko SPR 007 7A28-7020, the Seiko H558-5000, SPW001, the Seiko 6923-8080 SPD09, and a Rolex Datejust, which I'm not certain of, but it is believed to be the reference 1603. That last watch is interesting because obviously Roger Moore had not been wearing a Rolex since his third movie as James Bond, and all of a sudden it makes an appearance here. And from what I have read, this was just an accident. This Datejust was Roger Moore's personal watch. You can see it very clearly in the scene where he discovers the body of one of his colleagues. He was supposed to be wearing the aforementioned Seiko 6923, but he had his personal watch on and it ended up in the film. After Roger Moore retired, Timothy Dalton won the role. I believe Pierce Brosnan actually went for it at this time, but Timothy Dalton won out. He did 2 films as James Bond, The Living Daylights in 1987 and License to Kill in 1989. In The Living Daylights, he wore a Tag Heuer Professional Night Diver, reference 980.031, and in License to Kill, he wore the Rolex Submariner, reference 16610. Neither watch was a gadget watch. And this actually marks the end of Rolex appearing in James Bond films, which is noteworthy because Ian Fleming, when he wrote James Bond, wrote him with a Rolex. So it's often been seen as the most pure version of the watch that James Bond is supposed to wear. But obviously, as we move into the Omega era here, this is actually the last time we see any non-Omega watch on James Bond's wrist. Pierce Brosnan did get his chance to play James Bond after Timothy Dalton, and he had 4 films to his name. He did GoldenEye in 1995, Tomorrow Never Dies in 1997, The World Is Not Enough in 1999, and Die Another Day in 2002. As I mentioned earlier, this is where Omega made the deal with being the official watch of James Bond. There's not a lot of variety during the Pierce Brosnan era, though this was the instance where gadget watches became the go-to. In fact, every single watch that Pierce Brosnan wore was a gadget watch. GoldenEye is the one exception to all the other watches. It was the Omega Seamaster Professional 300M, reference 2541.80. That is a quartz-driven watch. In the movie, the gadget capabilities were a laser and a built-in detonator. Then for Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, and Die Another Day, James Bond uses the mechanical version, the Omega Seamaster Professional, reference 2531.80. Now, even though it's the same reference number for all 3 of these films, the capabilities of the watch did vary. So in Tomorrow Never Dies, the gadget capability was remote detonation of a hand grenade. In The World Is Not Enough, the gadget was both a powerful light and a grappling hook. And then Die Another Day took a page out of GoldenEye, and the watch had a laser and a built-in detonator. The final James Bond at the time of this recording was Daniel Craig, who did wrap up and is officially retired at this point as of his 2021 release. But he did 5 films: Casino Royale in 2006, Quantum of Solace in 2008, Skyfall in 2012, Spectre in 2015, and No Time to Die in 2021. Gets a little more complicated here, not so much in terms of the watches that Daniel Craig wore, but when it comes to researching, there are sort of commemorative watches that Omega started to do, especially in the latter films, tied to them, but not actually appearing in the movies, or at least not in all instances. So sometimes when you search for James Bond watches regarding Daniel Craig, you'll get watches that were made in honor of the movie, but not used in the movie. But let's start with Casino Royale. He wore 2 watches in that: the Omega Seamaster Planet Ocean, reference 2900.50.91, and the Omega Seamaster Professional 300M, reference 2220.80.00. In Quantum of Solace, Daniel Craig wore 1 watch as James Bond, the Omega Seamaster Planet Ocean, reference 2201.50.00. In Skyfall, once again, Daniel Craig wore 2 watches. One was the Omega Seamaster Aquaterra, reference 231.10.39.21.03.003, and also the Omega Seamaster Planet Ocean, reference 232.30.42.21.01.001. In Spectre, once again, Daniel Craig wore 2 Omega watches. One is the Omega Seamaster Aquaterra, reference 231.10.42.21.03.003, and the Omega Seamaster 300, reference 233.32.31.41.21.001.001. That latter watch is also the only instance I am aware of where Daniel Craig had a gadget watch, and it had an explosive. And finally, for No Time to Die, Daniel Craig only was associated with one Omega watch. It was the Omega Seamaster Diver 007 edition. I thank all of you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please do give it a like. In terms of comments, I would be interested in knowing, do any of you own any of these watches that I've covered? I don't actually own a specific James Bond watch. I do have an Omega 300M, which, well, Brosnan and Craig both had those types of watches. I don't actually have that specific reference number. I'd also be interested in who is your favorite James Bond and which film is your favorite. I read somewhere once years ago that people's favorite Bond typically is the very first one that they were exposed to. And in my instance, that would be Roger Moore. And I think the very first movie I saw actually was the very low-rated A View to a Kill, which wouldn't be my favorite film. But for a long time, Roger Moore, I would say, was my favorite Bond. I really sort of accepted that campy nature, probably because that was what I first saw. Though I would admit at this point, Pierce Brosnan and Daniel Craig acted the role out way better than Roger Moore did. But anyway, if you have thoughts, please leave the comments below. If you want to be notified when I have new videos out, just click that subscribe button. And I hope you all have a really good day. Take care.